I came to celebrate the most important night of my husband's career. Instead, a young woman at the reception desk smiled with practiced politeness and told me she was terribly sorry, but my name was not on the guest list. 30 seconds later, 2 security officers were walking me out of the ballroom as if I were a stranger who had wandered in off the street. I did not argue. I turned around, crossed the marble lobby, and walked straight to my car. One text message. That was all it took. The collector's fountain pen sat in a dark blue gift box on the passenger's seat as I drove toward downtown Chicago. I glanced at it every time the traffic lights turned red, the engraved date catching the glow of the dashboard. Victor had admired that vintage Parker duofold for years, whenever we drifted through antique shops on quiet Saturday mornings. I had finally found one in perfect condition and paid extra to have today's date cut into the clip, the day he became CEO. I had imagined we would remember the evening for the pen, the speeches, the quiet pride of 34 years built together. I had been wrong about almost everything. A doorman in a crisp uniform opened the door of the Drake Hotel with the same cheerful smile he offered everyone who arrived in expensive cars. The lobby hummed with conversation. Polished shoes clicked across marble. Servers carried silver trays of champagne toward the ballroom. Everywhere I looked, people wore the particular confidence that comes with tailored suits and successful careers. I recognized faces immediately: old suppliers, retired employees, a warehouse manager who had been with us nearly 25 years, even a state senator Victor had met only weeks earlier. Several of them smiled as they passed. Most looked faintly surprised to see me arriving alone. Victor had left the house 3 hours earlier. He needed photographs with the board before the ceremony began. That morning he had kissed my forehead the way he always did, and said he would see me tonight. Nothing in his voice had warned me. I smoothed the dark blue dress he had given me for our 30th anniversary and walked to the check-in table with the steady confidence of a woman who belonged. A young staff member with a gold badge looked up. "Good evening. Name, please?" "Margaret Hale." Her fingers moved across the keyboard, then stopped. "I'm sorry. Could you spell that for me?" I did. She searched again. The professional smile slipped a fraction. "I'm so sorry. I don't seem to have a reservation under that name." I laughed quietly, the sound automatic. "That's all right. I'm Victor Hale's wife. I'm sure it's just a mix-up." She tried a third time. Nothing. She apologized, asked me to wait, and disappeared through a side door. The knot in my stomach tightened. Not fear, exactly, but a sharp, unfamiliar confusion. After years of organizing company events myself, I knew guest lists could contain errors. Perhaps someone had used my maiden name. Perhaps an invitation had simply been overlooked. The young woman returned with a middle-aged man, wearing an event manager badge. His expression was careful, practiced, the face of someone trained to deliver unwelcome news without raising his voice. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I'm afraid your name is not on the approved guest list for this evening." I kept my tone polite. There must be some misunderstanding. "I'm Victor Hale's wife." He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Then he reached for the radio on his hip and requested security at the main entrance. The words sounded louder than they should have in the elegant lobby. 2 officers approached within moments. Neither looked aggressive. If anything, they looked embarrassed. The older one, gray-haired and roughly my age, lowered his voice. "Mom, we've double-checked the list." I met his eyes. "Please just tell my husband I'm here." He pressed a finger to his earpiece, listened, and gave a barely visible nod. When he looked back at me, I already knew the answer. He swallowed and apologized. Mr. Hale personally approved the guest list for tonight. For a split second the noise of the lobby vanished. I turned toward the open doors of the ballroom, crystal chandeliers, round tables in white linen, a giant screen cycling through photographs of Victor's career. And then I saw him. He stood near the stage, laughing with members of the board. His gaze drifted toward the entrance, toward me. For one impossible second our eyes met. Recognition flickered across his face, then he turned away. No surprise, no confusion, no step in my direction. just a deliberate shift of the shoulder as he resumed the conversation. That single movement cut deeper than anything the security officers could have said. The older guard cleared his throat. "Mom, we need to ask you to come with us." I nodded. I understood. Neither man touched me, they simply walked on either side of me as we crossed the lobby. Conversations quieted. Curious glances followed. One supplier I had known for 15 years flushed and looked away as if he had been caught staring at something he was not supposed to see. Outside, the warm Chicago evening air touched my face. I thanked both officers for treating me with respect. The older one answered quietly, "I'm very sorry, Mom, for what it's worth." I was sorry too. I got into the car, closed the door, and rested both hands on the steering wheel. For a full minute, I stared at the glowing windows of the ballroom. Then I picked up my phone and typed one sentence: "Freeze the Hale family trust assets." Effective immediately. Less than 10 seconds later, our lawyer, Julian Reed, replied, "Margaret, are you absolutely sure?" I looked one last time at the ballroom lights, then typed a single word: "Yes." The first call came before I had even pulled away from the curb. "Victor." I let it ring. The second was from Julian. Then Richard Lang, chairman of the board, followed by two numbers I did not recognize. By the time I reached Lakeshore Drive, the phone had vibrated so many times I switched it to silent. City lights streaked past the windows. With every block, a different memory rose. In 1988, there had been no ballroom, no board of directors, no carefully curated guest list. There had been a rented office above an auto body shop, one battered Ford F-150, and an IBM Selectric typewriter that jammed whenever the humidity changed. Victor found the clients. I kept the rest of our lives from collapsing. I typed invoices after the children were in bed, balanced payroll at the kitchen table, called suppliers at 7 in the morning to beg for another week on payment terms. When fuel prices spiked in 1998 and 3 major clients delayed their invoices, I sold the modest stock portfolio my father had left me and put every dollar into the company without hesitation. Victor had cried that night. He held my hands and promised that someday everyone would know what I had done. I had believed him. Years later, when his father suffered a stroke, I stepped back from daily operations because someone had to drive the older man to therapy, manage his medications, and sit with him through long afternoons when he no longer remembered where he was. Then our daughter Sophie had twins, and I became the grandmother who left everything to pick them up from daycare whenever her hospital shifts ran late. I never disappeared. I simply became essential in ways no annual report ever measured. By the time I turned onto our quiet, tree-lined street, the old story had already been rewritten without me. Sophie's SUV sat in the driveway. She stood on the porch, still wearing dark blue scrubs under a beige coat, hair pinned up from a long shift. The moment I stepped out of the car, she came down the path. "Mom," her face told me she already knew. I unlocked the front door and we went inside. The house still smelled faintly of the cinnamon candle I had lit before leaving. A casserole I had prepared for the next day sat on the counter under foil, as if ordinary life had not just cracked open. Sophie placed a glossy program on the table. She said she had left the event as soon as she heard what happened. I opened it. On the second page was a photograph of Victor, beneath the words, "Founder, Innovator, Architect of the Hale Legacy." My name appeared nowhere, not in the company history, not in the acknowledgements, not even on the timeline. "He's been telling people you don't like these kinds of events," Sophie said quietly. "He said you preferred staying home." I folded the program carefully. Tearing it would have given it more importance than it deserved. My phone lit up again with Victor's name. Sophie watched me ignore the call. Then she drew a slow breath. "There's something else." I waited. I heard Dad talking to Natalie backstage. He said that after tonight they wouldn't have to hide anymore. The kitchen went very still. "Hide what?" Sophie's eyes filled. "Their relationship." The words stayed in the air long after she finished speaking. I repeated them once, not because I had failed to hear, but because saying them aloud forced the truth into the room with us. She sat across from me at the same table where we had once wrapped Christmas gifts and assembled science fair projects. Neither of us touched the coffee I had poured. I asked when she had found out. She looked at her hands. About 2 months ago. I was at a medical conference in Cleveland. Dad said he was meeting a supplier nearby. I walked into the hotel restaurant and saw them together. They weren't acting like colleagues. Why didn't you tell me? Her voice broke. I wanted to. I almost called you that night. But Dad swore I already knew, that the marriage had been over for years, and we were both just waiting for the right moment. I nodded slowly. He had lied to her as cleanly as he had lied to me. She reached across the table and took my hand, whispering that she was sorry. I squeezed her fingers. This was not her burden. Anger would have been easy. What settled over me instead was a deep, bone-level weariness. 34 years of marriage do not vanish in a single evening. They fray thread by thread, often long before anyone notices the fabric is already torn. The phone buzzed again. Victor, this time I answered. Margaret, what the hell are you doing? His voice carried no concern, only fury. I assume you're calling about the trust. You froze everything. Do you have any idea what you've done? I know exactly what I've done. He accused me of embarrassing him in front of the board. I looked around the kitchen we had remodeled together 15 years earlier. No, Victor, you embarrassed me in front of the entire company. Silence. Then a sharp exhale. Natalie thought it would be awkward if you came, so she took you off the list. I approved it. The words arrived with startling calm, no denial, no attempt to soften the blow. He continued. He had not wanted drama on the night people expected a new CEO to project stability. His wife of 34 years apparently threatened that image. He added that I had not been involved in the business for years. I almost laughed. I stopped coming to the office because your father needed round-the-clock care. Then our daughter needed help with the twins. You thanked me for those sacrifices. That's different. It's exactly the same, I said quietly. You've simply decided those years no longer count. He had no answer for that. Instead, he claimed I was derailing the succession process, that hundreds of employees depended on the transition. I told him I had cancelled nothing. Only paused it until I understood how someone thought they could erase both my marriage and my ownership with a guest list. He muttered something under his breath. The line went dead. 5 minutes later, Julian called. His voice was careful. I've been looking at the corporate file. There's something you need to know. What is it? 3 months ago, paperwork was drafted requesting a temporary transfer of voting rights in the family trust. My heart slowed. I never signed anything. A pause. I know. The signature on file doesn't look quite right. Outside, rain began to strike the kitchen windows. For the first time all night, I understood this was no longer only about an affair. Someone had tried to replace my voice with a signature that was never mine. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same image. Victor looking straight at me from across that ballroom, recognizing me, and then turning away as if 34 years could be dismissed with a single shift of the shoulder. By 6:30 the next morning, I was sitting across from Julian Reed in a conference room high in the Aeon Center. He slid a thick binder across the polished table and told me he had already notified Richard Lang. The board had agreed to convene at 9. I nodded. Julian studied my face. You don't have to do this today if you're not ready. I almost smiled. Most of my adult life had been spent being ready for hard days. The Hale Family Trust had never been designed to give me power over Victor. My father had insisted on it decades earlier after investing in the young company. He believed success could change people, and he wanted a safeguard that protected both the business and the family if emotion ever clouded judgment. At the time, Victor had agreed without hesitation. Neither of us had imagined we would one day sit on opposite sides of a boardroom table. The meeting began on schedule. Richard Lang, 68, gray hair neatly combed, looked tired. I wish we were meeting under more favorable circumstances, he said. So do I. Victor arrived moments later. His charcoal suit was immaculate, but the confidence he usually wore like a second skin had developed fine cracks overnight. Natalie Brooks followed him into the room and did not meet my eyes. Victor did not look at me either. Julian outlined the legal position first. The Hale Family Trust was exercising its contractual right to pause the CEO's succession pending further review. A hush settled over the table. Richard turned to Victor. "Would you care to explain why Mrs. Hale was removed from last night's event?" Victor shifted. "That's a personal matter." "No," Richard answered calmly. "The moment security escorts a principal owner from a corporate leadership event, it becomes a corporate matter." A muscle jumped in Victor's jaw. Helen Brooks, the CFO, cleared her throat and passed around several printed spreadsheets. In preparing final documents, they had identified executive expenses that required clarification. Highlighted lines showed a luxury hotel booking in Aspen, a year-long apartment lease, consulting payments to a marketing firm owned by Natalie's brother, and relocation expenses approved months before the board had even voted on Victor's promotion. Victor leaned forward at once, insisting the charges were legitimate business costs. Richard replied that no one was making accusations, only asking questions. I spoke for the first time. "I don't want assumptions. I want an independent audit. If every charge is legitimate, the records will prove it." Richard nodded slowly. "I agree." One by one, the directors raised their hands. The vote was unanimous. Richard looked at Victor with open disappointment. "Until the audit is complete, your appointment as CEO is suspended. You are placed on administrative leave." For the first time since I met him at 19, my husband looked genuinely frightened, not because he had lost the title, but because the story he had spent years rewriting had just stopped being the only version anyone in that room was willing to believe. By the following Tuesday, the company felt less like a business and more like a courtroom. Conversations in the hallways stopped whenever someone walked past. Emails carried more weight than their subject lines suggested. Rumors moved faster than facts, and I refused to feed either. Julian called just after breakfast. The handwriting expert finished the preliminary review. "He's reasonably certain the signature on the power of attorney document was not made by you." I set my coffee down. The confirmation brought no relief, only a heavier understanding. Someone had decided my consent was not even worth requesting. Can he prove who signed it? Not yet. But the digital file originated from a computer assigned to the Public Relations Department, Natalie's department. Not proof. No longer a coincidence either. That afternoon, Julian arranged a small meeting room at his firm. He said someone wanted to speak with me privately. When Natalie Brooks walked in, she looked nothing like the polished executive who had appeared in magazine photographs beside Victor. Exhaustion sat openly on her face. No amount of makeup could hide it. She stood for a moment uncertain. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "I wanted to hear your side," I said. She sat opposite me, hands tightly clasped. "I didn't know everything. I waited." "I know you probably don't believe that." "I haven't decided what to believe yet." She nodded slowly. "Victor told me your marriage had been over for years. He said you preferred staying home with the grandchildren, that you had already agreed to step away from the company, and that once the CEO announcement was finished, the divorce would be handled quietly." Every sentence sounded rehearsed. Not quite a lie, but a carefully incomplete truth. "He said you hated public events. He told me having you there would only make everyone uncomfortable, so I removed your name." A single tear tracked down her cheek. And Victor knew. He approved it. The words landed with less force than I expected. Perhaps because I already knew. I asked about the trust paperwork. Natalie hesitated. "I never forged your signature. That wasn't my question." She looked down. "I was asked to gather copies of older corporate documents that already carried your signature." "Who asked?" She swallowed. "Victor." The room stayed silent. She was not accusing him of forgery, but neither was she defending him. She was simply stating what she had done. "I thought it was for archival purposes," she whispered. Looking back, I realize I stopped asking questions because I liked the answers I was receiving. That, more than anything, sounded like the truth. After a moment, I asked something she clearly did not expect. Did Victor ever tell you about 1998? She frowned. No, the year the company nearly went under. She shook her head. He never mentioned it. I smiled without humor. Of course he hadn't. I looked out the window at the Chicago skyline and remembered another spring nearly 30 years earlier. We were 3 weeks from bankruptcy. 2 major clients had collapsed. Fuel prices had spiked. The bank had refused another extension. Victor was ready to close the doors. My father had left me a modest stock portfolio. I sold nearly all of it and placed the money into the company so it could survive. You did that? Natalie asked. Yes. The funny part is that Victor wept when I handed him the cashier's check. He promised he would spend the rest of his life making certain no one ever forgot what I had done. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Natalie whispered, I never knew that. Then, quieter still, I believe you. As she stood to leave, she paused at the door. For what it's worth, I am sorry. I believe that too, I answered. After she left, Julian returned. The buyers just called. They're concerned about the audit. I expected that. They also want to know if you would be willing to negotiate with them directly. That surprised me. Why me? Julian gave a faint smile. Because they've concluded you're the only one left they trust. The words followed me all the way home. The only one they trust. I did not feel powerful. I felt tired. For years I had believed that if I simply continued doing the right thing, the truth would eventually speak for itself. Now I was learning something different. The truth does not always speak. Sometimes it waits for someone to give it a voice. The buyers wanted to meet the next morning. Before I agreed, I asked Julian to arrange one more stop. I wanted to visit the original warehouse. He looked surprised. The South Side building? Yes. Vance Logistics now operated 4 distribution centers across the Midwest, but the faded brick warehouse on the south side of the city was where everything had begun. It had been renovated more than once, yet the smell of cardboard, diesel, and coffee remained exactly as I remembered. When I stepped onto the loading dock, conversations quieted. Then a familiar voice called out, Mrs. Hale. I turned and smiled. Frank Morales had started with us as a driver 28 years earlier. His hair was completely white now, and his knees moved more carefully, but his handshake was still firm. He said word had already traveled that I might come. Within minutes, half a dozen employees had gathered, not for gossip, but for answers. I told them only what was true. The company was not closing. A few shoulders eased. The audit was still underway. Someone asked whether Mr. Hale would be coming back. I answered honestly that I did not know. No one pressed further. Instead, Frank said quietly, we just want to know if our pensions are safe. That question struck harder than anything Victor had said. Not titles, not promotions, retirements, college funds for grandchildren, health insurance, real lives. Later, the warehouse manager, Carla Torres, pulled me aside. You should probably see this. She handed me a folder of draft staffing charts that someone had accidentally printed on the warehouse copier weeks earlier. Several names were highlighted in yellow, mostly employees over 58. Beside each name appeared the same note, position to be eliminated post-transition. I turned the pages slowly. More lists, drivers, dispatchers, mechanics, people who had given decades to the company. My breath caught. Was this circulated? Carla shook her head. No, Mr. Hale said it was only a preliminary draft. I closed the folder. Whatever was happening between Victor and me concerned our marriage. This did not. That afternoon, I met with the buyer's deputy director, Claire Donovan. She was direct. They still wanted to acquire the company, but not if the transition dissolved into years of litigation. I said I understood. She leaned forward. What will it take for you to support the deal? I had spent most of the night considering that exact question. My terms aren't complicated, I said. She waited. No layoffs for at least 2 years. She made a note. Existing pension obligations remain fully funded. Another note. Health insurance benefits stay intact. She nodded. And no leadership restructuring that targets older employees simply because they are close to retirement. Claire studied me for a long moment. Those aren't financial demands. No, I replied. They're protections for the people who built this place. For the first time, she smiled. I think we can work with that. When I reached home that night, another envelope waited in the mailbox. Legal papers. Victor had formally filed for divorce. Attached was a motion asking the court to grant him temporary authority over the Hale family trust during the proceedings. I read every page carefully, then called Julian. He really believes this will work? I don't think he believes it, Julian answered quietly. I think he's desperate. 3 days later, we stood before a county judge. Victor barely looked at me. His attorney argued that because I had stepped back from day-to-day management years earlier, control of the trust should temporarily shift to Victor so the business could continue functioning. Julian presented the original trust documents, board minutes, and financial statements spanning 30 years. The judge examined them, then looked over his glasses. Mrs. Hale never relinquished her authority. He closed the folder. Motion denied. Reporters waited outside the courthouse. Victor caught up to me before I reached the car. Margaret, I stopped. His voice sounded hollow. Why are you doing this? I looked at him for a long time, then answered as honestly as I could. Because I finally stopped believing your version of our story. He had nothing left to say. As I drove away, Julian called again. The buyers have made a decision. What is it? They no longer want Victor in the negotiations. They're asking whether you will represent the trust's interests in his place. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. The road ahead was clearer than it had been in years, and colder. The next morning, I walked into the buyer's downtown offices carrying only a yellow legal pad. Claire Donovan met me with a firm handshake. I'm glad you could make it. So am I said. I'd rather settle this than spend the next 2 years court. She smiled. That's exactly what we hoped to hear. The boardroom windows framed the Chicago skyline. Glass towers caught the morning light, while ordinary traffic moved far below, people heading to ordinary jobs, unaware that the future of a company employing hundreds across the Midwest was being decided several floors above them. Claire slid a revised offer across the table. They had reviewed my earlier conditions. I read every page with deliberate care. Nothing in the past week had taught me the value of patience more clearly. No layoffs for 24 months, I read aloud. Correct. Existing pension obligations remain fully funded. Yes, no reduction in healthcare benefits for retirees. Guaranteed, I continued. A new tuition assistance program for employees' children. Strengthened severance terms after the 2-year guarantee period. An independent monitor during the leadership transition. I looked up. This is considerably better. Claire folded her hands. We're building a long-term business. Keeping experienced people is worth more than replacing them. I could not help thinking how differently Victor would have viewed the same employees. Somewhere along the way, he had begun to see seniority as an expense rather than an asset. Ambition had quietly replaced gratitude. I'll recommend these terms, I said. Claire hesitated. There is one additional condition. I raised an eyebrow. Mr. Hale cannot return as CEO after the deal closes. I did not answer immediately, not because I disagreed, but because hearing the words spoken aloud carried a finality I had not fully absorbed until that moment. I understand. When the meeting ended, Julian walked with me to the parking garage. How are you holding up? I gave a quiet laugh. I keep waiting to feel as if I've won. I don't, he nodded. Justice and celebration are not always the same thing. Later that day, an unexpected call came through. Natalie. She spoke quietly, saying she knew she had no right to ask, but could we meet once more? We chose a small coffee shop away from the loop. She arrived without makeup, in jeans and a plain sweater, instead of the tailored suits she had worn for years. I submitted my resignation this morning, she said. I was not surprised. They accepted it. Yes, she wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. I've been thinking a great deal about the person I became these past months. We sat in silence for a while. Finally, she took a flash drive from her purse and pushed it across the table. What's this? Expense reports. The transfers I questioned months ago. Victor told me they were confidential executive matters. You kept copies, she nodded. Some part of me must have known something was wrong. I took the drive. Thank you. She looked down. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know, but you stopped pretending you had no part in it. That matters. As we stood to leave, she said something that stayed with me. Do you know what Victor was most afraid of? What? He never worried about losing the company. She met my eyes directly. He was terrified that people would finally realize you were the one who had held it together the entire time. That evening, Julian called after reviewing the files Natalie had provided. The audit team has confirmed the unauthorized executive reimbursements. How much? Enough to require full restitution, but not enough to endanger the company. I exhaled slowly. Good. He gave a short, dry chuckle. Most people would ask whether it was enough to destroy him. I don't want to destroy him. I want the truth to outlast him. Julian was quiet for a moment. Margaret, there's something else. Several executive accounts were emptied in the days immediately before the board meeting. My stomach tightened. Transferred where? We're still tracing the path. Harrison, Victor, had not stopped making desperate decisions. He had simply begun making larger ones. The full audit report arrived the following Monday. Julian did not email it. He brought the binder to the house himself. When I opened the door, he stood there holding it against his chest, looking weary but resolved. I thought this deserved a conversation in person. I led him to the kitchen, the same kitchen where Victor and I had once planned delivery routes on legal pads and celebrated our first national contract with frozen pizza because we could not afford anything else. Julian set the binder on the table. The auditors finished over the weekend. I sat down. Tell me. He opened to the executive summary. The good news is the company remains financially sound. The acquisition can proceed. My shoulders eased a fraction. And the rest? He slid a page toward me. Unauthorized reimbursements. Personal travel booked as client development. Luxury hotel suites unrelated to business. Corporate funds used for private expenses connected to Victor's planned relocation. None of it would have bankrupted the firm, but every line violated policy. He'll have to repay all of it, Julian said quietly. The board has already voted. Has Victor seen the report? An hour ago. He didn't dispute the numbers. That surprised me. For years, Victor could invent a justification for almost anything. His silence worried me more than another argument would have. By noon, Richard Lang had called an emergency board session. The atmosphere this time was entirely different. No one waited for theatrics. No one expected miracles. They simply wanted resolution. Richard surveyed the room before speaking. The independent audit is complete. He folded his hands. Based on its findings, the board votes unanimously for the permanent removal of Victor Hale as CEO. There was no applause, only a quiet collective acceptance. Richard continued. The transition committee will proceed under the revised terms negotiated by the Hale Family Trust. It was finished, not with spectacle or vengeance, but with a formal vote entered into the corporate record. When the meeting adjourned, I remained seated for a moment, looking at the empty chair across the table where Victor had spent so many years. Success had once seemed to fit him so naturally. Now I wondered whether it had always been concealing something more fragile underneath. Sophie stopped by that evening after her hospital shift. She looked drained. I saw Dad today. I poured her tea. How is he? She sighed. I've never seen him like that. She described his house as strangely empty. The framed degrees still hung on the walls, but the confidence that once filled every room had vanished. He kept saying everyone betrayed him. I looked into my cup. Did you say anything? Sophie hesitated. I told him no one betrayed him. She swallowed. I told him he betrayed you. Tears stood in her eyes. Not because he fell for someone else. Because he spent years pretending your life never happened. We were both silent for a few seconds. Finally, she whispered. He cried. I closed my eyes. Some part of me had been imagining this moment for days. Victor finally facing the consequences, finally understanding. Yet the news that he had broken did not feel like triumph. It felt like mourning the man I once believed I had married. Later that night the phone rang. Victor. After a long pause I answered. His voice sounded older, quieter. I know I don't deserve your time. No, I answered honestly. You don't. I just need one meeting. Why? Not to change your mind. He paused. I need to tell you something before the board finalizes everything. I leaned back in the chair. What could you possibly have left to say? His reply was so soft I almost missed it. The truth. For the first time since the night at the hotel, I believed he might actually mean it. I agreed to meet Victor the following day. Not at the house, not at the company. We chose Lincoln Park, near the conservatory, the same place we used to take Sophie on Saturday mornings years earlier to see the flowers. It felt like neutral ground, a location that belonged to memory rather than to lawyers. He was already sitting on a weathered wooden bench when I arrived. For a moment I almost failed to recognize him. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by a simple navy jacket and faded jeans. His shoulders sat lower than I remembered, as if a weight he had avoided for years had finally settled where it belonged. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. I sat at the opposite end of the bench. "You said you wanted to tell me the truth." He nodded. Yes. For several seconds he simply watched the lagoon. Then he spoke. "I didn't fall for Natalie because I was unhappy. I waited. I fell for being admired." The honesty was disarming. As the company grew, people stopped congratulating both of us. They congratulated me. He gave a short, bitter laugh. And I liked it. Every award carried my name. Every magazine wanted my photograph. Every conference introduced me as the founder. After a while I began to believe I had built it all myself. I watched him closely. And where did I go? He closed his eyes. Little by little. I encouraged the simpler narrative because investors preferred a single face. Reporters liked a one-man success story. Each time someone left your name out, I corrected them a little less. Eventually, I stopped correcting anyone at all. We sat in silence for a long time. Finally, I asked the question that had followed me since Julian's first call. "The trust documents." Victor swallowed. "I never forged your signature, but I did ask Natalie to gather older files that already contained it. I told myself it was only in case the lawyers needed reference copies." His voice broke. I knew exactly what I was asking for. He was not denying it. He was not blaming anyone else. I kept telling myself I would never use them. He looked directly at me. "But if Julian hadn't frozen the trust when he did, I think I would have." That admission hurt more than I expected. Not because the forgery had been completed, but because he had crossed the line inside his own mind, long before taking the final step. "I became someone I never thought I could be," he said. I believed him. Not because the words excused anything, but because I had watched the transformation unfold over years without fully naming it. He reached into his jacket and handed me a sealed envelope. "What is it?" "My resignation from the board. It's already signed." I should have submitted it before the audit was even finished. I did not open it. Instead I asked, "Why now?" He gave a tired smile. "Because for the first time in a very long time I don't want to win." Driving home I realized something unexpected. I no longer needed Victor to lose. The board would finish its work, the acquisition would close, the company would continue. None of it depended on my anger any longer. That evening Richard Lang called. The directors had voted unanimously. I listened in silence. The acquisition agreement was approved, employee protections and all. He paused. "We also voted to recognize the original founders at the closing ceremony." I smiled for the first time in days. Founders? Plural. A week later, I stood in the same ballroom security had escorted me from only weeks earlier. This time, Richard Lang was the first person at the podium. "Before we discuss financials or the future of the company," he said, looking out at the packed room, "this organization has a mistake to correct." A complete hush fell over the space. He turned toward me. "For too many years we have celebrated only one founder." He held out his hand. Mrs. Margaret Hale, would you please join me on stage? As I walked forward, hundreds of employees rose to their feet, not because I had won a contest, but because the truth had finally caught up to the official story. The applause was steady and sustained. I did not speak long. I simply thanked them for the work they had done across decades and said that the company had always belonged to more than one name. When I stepped back, the room remained standing a few moments longer. The formal closing of the acquisition lasted less than an hour. The legal documents had been negotiated for months. The public portion was brief. What stayed with me was not the transaction itself, but what happened after the clapping stopped. Employees moved through the ballroom in small groups, talking about pension security, new opportunities, and their families. For the first time in weeks, no one was whispering. No one was guessing what came next. They already knew the company would survive. That knowledge mattered more than whose name sat in the CEO's chair. Claire Donovan approached me before she left. I wanted to thank you. For what? You reminded everyone that businesses are not built on balance sheets alone. She smiled. They're built by the people who show up and do the work every day. I shook her hand. Take care of them. We will. Before she walked away, she added one last observation. It seems to me your husband forgot. He inherited a company long before he ever tried to run it. I carried those words for the rest of the afternoon. She was right. Victor had not inherited money. He had inherited trust. And trust, once squandered, is the one asset that cannot be recovered by any audit or board vote. In the days that followed, the practical details of the transition moved forward without drama. The independent monitor began work. The 2-year employment guarantees were written into the final agreements. Pension funding was confirmed. I attended the necessary meetings, signed the necessary pages, and then stepped back. My role had never been to run the company day to day. It had been to make certain the people who did run it could not erase the foundation they stood on. Sophie brought the twins over one evening. The house filled with the ordinary chaos of small children, shoes by the door, crayons on the table, the constant low sound of questions. Watching them, I felt the distance between the woman who had been walked out of a ballroom and the woman now setting out juice cups. The distance was real, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like terrain I had crossed. Victor sent a short written message through Julian a few days later. He had begun seeing a therapist. He was not asking for forgiveness or for any change in the legal arrangements. He simply wanted me to know. I read the message once and did not reply. Some information requires acknowledgement. It does not require conversation. At night, after the house grew quiet, I sometimes sat in the kitchen with a single light on and allowed the full sequence of events to move through my mind. The reception desk, the security officers, the deliberate turn of Victor's shoulder, the text message that froze the trust, the boardroom votes, the warehouse lists of names marked for elimination, the flash drive Natalie had pushed across a cafe table, the final public correction of the founding story. None of it felt like victory. It felt like the slow, necessary restoration of a record that had been allowed to tilt for too long. I had spent most of my adult life believing that quiet competence would eventually be recognized. I had learned that recognition is not automatic. Sometimes the record has to be corrected in public, in writing, under the eyes of the same people who once accepted the incomplete version. The correction did not erase the years. It simply refused to let them remain invisible. On a clear evening near the end of the month, I walked through the first floor of the house, turning off lights. The program from the CEO announcement still lay in a drawer, the photograph of Victor, printed beneath words that had once excluded me. I left it there. Destroying it would have given the old narrative more power than it still possessed. The new narrative, the one that finally included both names, had already been spoken aloud in a room full of employees who had chosen to stand. I switched off the last lamp and went upstairs. Sleep came more easily than it had in weeks. The story was no longer unfinished. It had simply required someone willing to stop protecting the incomplete version of it. A month later, the divorce was finalized. There were no dramatic courtroom confrontations, no last-minute speeches, no attempts at reconciliation. We divided what remained of our shared life the same way we divided the assets, through paper, signatures, and a long stretch of silence. As we left the courthouse, Victor stopped me near my car. He looked thinner than he had in the park. The navy jacket hung a little looser on his shoulders. "I'm seeing a therapist," he said. I nodded. "I hope it helps. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know." He looked down for a moment. "I spent years trying to be the most important person in every room." A faint, weary smile crossed his face. Somehow I ended up the smallest. I did not answer right away. Finally I said, "I hope you become someone you can live with." Those were the last words I ever spoke to him, not because hatred still burned, but because there was simply nothing left that required saying. He nodded once as if he had expected the finality, and walked away. I watched him go without following. Natalie sent a letter a few weeks later. She had taken a public relations position with a small charity outside the city. The letter was short and carefully written. She apologized again, not requesting absolution, only acknowledging the harm she had helped set in motion. I read it once and did not reply. Some conversations belong entirely to the past. Still, I hoped she would build something sturdier than the version of herself she had inhabited while standing beside Victor, a year after the night at the Drake Hotel. My days looked nothing like the life I had lived before. Every Wednesday morning I volunteered at a local small business center, sitting with women over 50 who were attempting second careers after layoffs, divorce, or early retirement. Many arrived convinced it was already too late. I recognized the expression. I had worn it myself in quieter forms for years. We talked about bookkeeping, funding applications, contracts, and marketing plans. Beneath every practical conversation ran a deeper current, the slow reconstruction of confidence, the recovery of dignity, the permission to begin again without apology. The Hale Family Trust also established a new scholarship for students entering logistics, supply chain management, and the skilled trades. The board insisted the fund carry both founders' names, the Victor and Margaret Hale Scholarship. I hesitated when they first proposed it, then agreed. History should not be rewritten in either direction. Victor had worked hard, so had I. The difference was that the official record had finally made room for both facts. Sophie brought the twins to the inaugural ceremony. After the photographs were taken, my oldest grandson tugged gently on my sleeve. "Grandma, yes, did you really help build the company?" I smiled. "I really did." He grinned. "Mom says you never gave up." I laughed softly. There were days I wanted to. He slipped his small hand into mine. "I'm glad you didn't." I was glad, too. People still asked from time to time whether I regretted the text message that froze the trust. They expected answers about legal strategy, corporate leverage, financial positioning. I told them something simpler. The message did not destroy my marriage. The marriage was already finished. The moment my husband decided, my absence would make his success appear brighter. The text only ended the lie that had been allowed to stand in its place. I also learned that justice and revenge are not the same species. Revenge wants the other person to suffer. Justice wants what still deserves to survive to be protected. In my case, that meant the employees who had trusted the company with their livelihoods, the business itself, my daughter's belief in fairness, and my own ability to look in the mirror without wondering whether years of silence had made me complicit. On the night security walked me out of the ballroom, they treated me as someone who did not belong. A year later, I understood something they could not have known at the time. No one can permanently escort you out of a story you helped write. They can remove your name from a list. They can take your photograph out of a program. They can even convince a room full of people, for a while, that you were never present. But the truth possesses a stubborn patience. If you protect it, live according to it, and refuse to abandon it when the cost rises, it eventually finds its way back into the open. The weeks after the divorce settled into a quieter rhythm. I sold the large suburban house. It held too many rooms that no longer served any purpose. The smaller place I moved into near the lake had clear light in the mornings and enough space for the twins when they stayed overnight. Sophie and I spoke more often than we had in years. Not about Victor, but about ordinary things, the children's school projects, a new recipe, a book one of us had finished. The absence of the old tension made room for a different kind of closeness. Occasionally, a piece of residual news reached me. Victor had taken a consulting role with a mid-sized firm in another state. Natalie was still with the charity. The company continued under its new ownership without public disruption. I received these fragments without seeking them and without lingering on them. They belonged to a chapter that had closed. One evening in early autumn, I sat on the small porch with a cup of tea and watched the light change over the water. The fountain pen Victor had never received still rested in its dark blue box in a drawer. I had considered returning it then, decided against the gesture. Some objects carry too much unfinished meaning. Better to let them remain where they are. I thought about the long sequence that had begun with a missing name on a guest list. The walk across the lobby, under the eyes of people I had known for decades, the text message sent from the front seat of my car, the boardroom votes, the warehouse lists of employees marked for quiet removal, the flash drive slid across a cafe table, the public correction of the founding story, the final signatures that ended the marriage. None of it felt like a triumph. It felt like the necessary repair of a record that had been allowed to lean too far in one direction for too long. The women I met at the business center sometimes asked how I had found the strength to act. I never gave them a dramatic answer. Strength, I had learned, is often just the moment when continuing to protect someone else's version of events becomes more painful than telling the truth. After that moment, the rest is only follow-through. Sophie called that night to say the twins had asked whether Grandma could come to their school harvest festival. I said yes. The request was small and ordinary, and exactly the size of the life I now wanted. I finished the tea, went inside, and began the short list of things I would need to bring. The house was quiet. The quiet no longer felt like absence, it felt like space that finally belonged to me. Outside, the last light left the lake. Inside, the next ordinary day was already taking shape. I had spent most of my adult life keeping other people's stories intact. For the first time, I was simply living inside my own. The small business center occupied the ground floor of a renovated brick building on the west side of the city. Every Wednesday, I arrived before the first appointment, unlocked the meeting room, and set out the same simple materials: a legal pad, a pen, a folder of basic templates for cash flow projections, and one-page business plans. The women who came were rarely dramatic. Most had spent decades keeping households or departments running and now found themselves starting over with less time and less certainty than they had possessed at 25. I recognized the careful way they sat in the chairs, the habit of minimizing their own experience before anyone else could dismiss it. One woman, a former school office manager in her late 50s, arrived convinced no bank would take her seriously. Another had run a successful catering side business for years while raising children and had never called it a business until the day her marriage ended. We worked through numbers, yes, but the real work was slower. It was the gradual permission to claim expertise they already possessed. I did not give speeches about resilience. I asked practical questions and waited while they discovered they already knew most of the answers. After several months, the center asked whether I would expand to 2 mornings a week. I agreed. The additional hours did not feel like obligation. They felt like the correct use of what I had learned the hard way. That competence kept quiet for too long can begin to look like absence, even to the person who owns it. The scholarship fund moved forward on its own steady schedule. Applications arrived from community colleges and trade programs across the state. The selection committee, composed of 2 board members, a logistics professor, and a longtime warehouse supervisor, worked with quiet seriousness. When the first cohort was chosen, Sophie insisted on attending the brief reception with the twins. My grandson, now a year older, stood beside the display board that listed the recipients, and read the names aloud with careful concentration. Afterward, he asked whether the students would drive trucks or work in offices. I told him both were possible. He seemed satisfied with the range of options. Livings alone in the smaller house near the lake required adjustments I had not fully anticipated. For decades, the rhythm of the day had been set by other people's needs. Victor's schedule, Sophie's children, the quiet logistics of keeping an extended household functional. Now the mornings belonged entirely to me. At first, the silence felt oversized. Gradually, it became a space I could fill deliberately. Early walks along the water, uninterrupted reading, the simple decision to cook or not to cook without consulting anyone else's preferences. I learned the difference between loneliness and solitude. One drains. The other restores. Occasionally a fragment of the old life surfaced without warning. A song from the early years of the company playing in a store, the particular shade of blue of the dress I had worn to the Drake Hotel. A news item about executive transitions in the logistics sector. Each time the memory rose, I let it pass through without following it. The past no longer required active management. It had been examined, documented, and placed in its proper proportion. Sophie and I fell into a steadier pattern of contact. She still worked long hospital shifts. I still collected the twins when her schedule required it. The difference was the absence of the old undercurrent, the careful avoidance of certain subjects, the unspoken knowledge that something in the family foundation had been unstable for years. Now the conversations were simpler. School projects. A new pediatric protocol she found interesting, whether the twins preferred the red or the blue rain boots. Ordinary subjects carried without strain. One Saturday the twins stayed overnight. We made pancakes in the morning and then walked to the small park near the lake. The older one asked, with the sudden seriousness children sometimes display, whether I was sad that Grandpa did not live with me anymore. I answered honestly that I had been sad for a long time before the change, and that I was not sad in the same way now. He considered this, then asked if I still liked pancakes. I said yes. The conversation moved on. Children often accept emotional truth more cleanly than adults do, provided it is offered without excess weight. I kept no photographs of Victor in the new house. The decision was practical rather than punitive. Certain images carry entire eras with them. I preferred the walls to remain open to the present. The dark blue gift box containing the engraved fountain pen stayed in a drawer for months before I finally donated it to a charity auction that supported literacy programs. I did not attach a note. The object had already performed the only function it needed to perform. It had reminded me, on a difficult night, of the gap between the story I thought we were living and the story that was actually unfolding. Julian checked in quarterly, more out of professional habit than necessity. The trust continued its work. The company under new ownership issued occasional public updates that reached me through ordinary channels. I read them the way I read any other business news. Interested, uninvolved. The employees, whose names had appeared on those preliminary elimination lists, remained employed through the guaranteed period and beyond. That single fact carried more satisfaction than any personal victory could have. In late autumn, the small business center held a modest evening reception for the women who had completed the first full cycle of mentoring. Several brought copies of their newly registered business licenses or photographs of their first paid clients. One woman, who had spent 30 years in corporate accounting and had been laid off 6 months before her pension fully vested, stood up and said she had finally stopped apologizing for wanting a second act. The room was quiet for a moment afterward. I recognized the look on several faces. The startled realization that the desire to continue mattering did not require permission from the life that had ended. After the event, I drove home along the lake. The water reflected the last of the city's lights. I thought about the night security had walked me across the Drake lobby, the way conversations had hushed, the way one supplier had flushed and looked away. At the time, the humiliation had felt absolute. Now it registered as a single scene in a longer sequence, the necessary fracture that allowed a more accurate story to surface. I had not chosen the fracture. I had chosen what to do once it occurred. The house was dark when I arrived. I turned on only the kitchen light, made a cup of tea, and sat at the small table that faced the window. No casserole waited under foil, no program from a corporate celebration lay on the counter. The ordinary objects of the present were enough. I drank the tea slowly and allowed the quiet to settle around me without needing to fill it. Somewhere in another state, Victor was living the revised version of his life. Somewhere Natalie was doing the same. Their chapters no longer intersected with mine in any way that required my attention. The company continued. The scholarship recipients continued. The women at the center continued. And I continued, not as the erased partner in someone else's success story. And not as a symbol of corporate revenge, but simply as a woman who had finally stopped protecting an incomplete record of her own life. The tea cooled. I rinsed the cup, turned off the light, and went upstairs. Sleep came without the old vigilance. The next Wednesday would bring new appointments at the center. The twins would visit on the weekend. The lake would still be there in the morning. Ordinary continuity had become the most reliable form of peace I knew. Winter came quietly that year. Snow settled on the lake path in thin, even layers and stayed for days at a time. I walked it most mornings, the same route, the same measured pace. The cold clarified things. It reduced the world to essentials, the sound of my own steps, the stretch of open water that refused to freeze completely. The simple fact of continuing, the small business center, kept its Wednesday and Friday rhythm. Some of the women I had met in the first months returned with updates, first contracts signed, first difficult clients managed, first moments of realizing they no longer needed to justify their presence in the room. Others arrived new, carrying the same careful hesitation I now recognized instantly. I did not tell them my story unless they asked. When they did, I gave them the shortened version. A long marriage, a public erasure, a decision to stop protecting someone else's incomplete account of events. Most listened without interruption. A few cried quietly. All of them, in different ways, understood the particular exhaustion of having been reliable for decades, only to discover reliability had made them invisible. The scholarship fund awarded its second cohort in the spring. Sophie brought the twins again. My grandson, taller now, stood in front of the same display board and read the new names with the same seriousness. Afterward, he asked whether I was proud of the students. I said I was proud of the work they were willing to do. He seemed to accept the distinction. Living alone no longer felt like an adjustment. It had become the ordinary architecture of my days. I cooked when I wanted to. I left dishes in the sink when I did not. I read late without checking whether the light disturbed anyone else. The freedom was not dramatic. It was cumulative. The slow accumulation of decisions that belonged only to me. Occasionally I still dreamed of the Drake Hotel lobby. In the dreams, the security officers were always polite. Victor always turned away at the same measured speed. I always walked to the car without speaking. The difference was that I no longer woke with the old jolt of adrenaline. The scene had become historical, like a photograph whose edges had softened with handling. I could look at it without stepping back inside it. Victor sent no further messages. Natalie sent none. The company issued its annual reports. I read the summaries the way I read any other industry news. The employees, whose names had once been highlighted for elimination, remained employed past the guaranteed period. That single continuing fact still carried more weight than any personal accounting. Sophie and I spoke more easily than we had in the final years of the marriage. The old caution around certain subjects had dissolved. We talked about the twins' school, about a difficult case at the hospital, about whether the lake house needed new weather stripping before the next winter. The conversations were ordinary and therefore precious. They required no translation, no careful omission of the truth. One evening in early summer, I sat on the small porch with a glass of water and watched the light change over the water. The same porch, the same hour of the day, Yet the woman sitting there was not the woman who had once waited for a husband to come home and explain a guest list. That earlier woman had spent decades translating neglect into busyness, erasure into misunderstanding, silence into loyalty. The woman on the porch had stopped translating. She had simply recorded what was true and then refused to carry the false version any farther. I thought about the long chain of small decisions that had made the larger rupture possible. The years of stepping back to care for Victor's father, the years of being the reliable grandmother, the gradual acceptance that my absence from the office was being rewritten as lack of interest. None of those decisions had been wrong in isolation. Together they had created the conditions in which a husband could believe my removal from a ballroom would be only a minor awkwardness. The correction had required a single clear action. The text message that froze the trust, but the clarity itself had been years in the making. People sometimes still asked whether I hated Victor. The question always arrived with the expectation of heat. I answered honestly. I did not hate him. Hatred would have required ongoing emotional investment. What I felt was closer to the distant recognition one gives a former colleague whose choices are no longer one's responsibility. He had become someone I used to be married to. That was the entire remaining relationship. The fountain pen never reappeared in my thoughts with any force. Objects lose their charge once the story that animated them has been finished. The dark blue dress from the anniversary had been given away months earlier. The large suburban house belonged to someone else. Even the memory of the security officer's careful politeness had softened into something almost neutral. They had been doing their job. I had been doing mine, finally. In the autumn, the center asked whether I would speak at a small regional conference on midlife entrepreneurship. I almost declined. Public speaking had never been a skill I sought. Then I considered the women who would be in the room. Many of them the same age I had been when I sold the stock portfolio to keep the company alive, and I accepted. I prepared no dramatic remarks. I spoke about the practical necessity of keeping accurate records, of refusing to let other people narrate your contribution out of existence, of understanding that silence is sometimes interpreted as agreement. The audience listened with the particular stillness of people who recognize their own experience in someone else's sentences. Afterward, 3 women approached separately to say they had finally decided to stop waiting for permission that was never going to arrive. That was enough, winter returned. The lake path froze harder. I walked it anyway. One morning the light was so clear it seemed to erase distance. I stopped at the usual point and looked out over the water. 34 years of marriage. A single night in a hotel lobby. A text message. A year of legal and emotional disentanglement. And then this. Ordinary continuity, earned rather than granted. I no longer measured my days against the life that had ended. The measurement had become internal and simple. Was the work useful? Was the quiet genuine? Was the next ordinary task still worth doing? The answers remained steady enough to trust. Sophie called that afternoon to ask whether I could take the twins overnight on Friday. I said yes. The request was small, practical, and exactly the size of the life I had rebuilt. I finished the call, made a short list of what the children would need, and stood for a moment in the kitchen while the late light moved across the floor. Outside, the day was ending. Inside, the next one was already taking shape. I had once believed that a well-lived life would eventually be recognized without effort. I had learned that recognition is not the point. The point is to refuse to disappear from your own story, even when the people closest to you have already written you out of it. No one can escort you from a narrative you helped create. They can remove your name from a list. They can turn away when your eyes meet theirs across a crowded room. They can convince themselves for a time that your absence improves the picture, but the truth remains patient. If you protect it long enough and live in accordance with it, it finds its way back into the light, not as revenge, not as spectacle, but as the simple durable correction of the record. I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. Sleep came without negotiation. Tomorrow would contain a walk by the lake, a few hours at the center, possibly a conversation with Sophie about the twins' weekend plans. Ordinary pieces. Sufficient pieces. The only kind I now required. The story that had begun with a missing name on a guest list had ended with a woman who no longer needed anyone else to confirm that she had been present all along. That was enough.